The date is October 14th, 1985. The location is the deep, freezing expanse of the Pacific Ocean, 300 miles off the coast of Southern California. The time is 3 a.m. From the perspective of a Soviet naval analyst sitting in a windowless bunker in Vladivostok, the ocean is not water. It is a grid of data points. It is a mathematical equation of radar returns, thermal signatures, and magnetic anomalies. For 40 years, this grid has been the chessboard. Every American carrier group is a massive spike in the data. Every submarine is a subtle whisper that the Soviet Union has spent billions of rubles trying to hear. But tonight, the grid is broken. Major Yuri Petrov stares at the thermal readout printed on a sheet of grainy thermal paper. The image comes from a RORSAT, a radar ocean reconnaissance satellite passing overhead in low Earth orbit. These nuclear-powered satellites are the eyes of the Kremlin. They blast the ocean with radar waves and listen for the bounce back. Steel reflects. Water scatters. It is simple physics. If there is a ship, the radar screams its location. Petrov adjusts his glasses. He looks at the coordinates. According to human intelligence assets on the ground in San Diego, a high-value American target departed the harbor 4 hours ago. The spies said it was significant. They said the security perimeter was tighter than a nuclear launch site. They said the harbor was cleared of all civilian traffic. So, Petrov looks at the satellite data for a destroyer. He looks for a cruiser. He looks for the massive, unmistakable signature of an aircraft carrier. He sees nothing. The radar return is flat. The ocean at those coordinates appears completely empty. According to the finest technology the Soviet Union possesses, there is absolutely nothing on the surface of the water. But then, Petrov looks at the second layer of data. The sea state analysis. The ocean is rough tonight. Waves are cresting at 6 feet. When a ship moves through water, it leaves a wake, a scar of turbulent white water that lingers long after the vessel has passed. The satellite's high-resolution optical cameras, struggling through breaks in the cloud cover, pick up something impossible. There is a wake. A distinct, V-shaped scar cuts through the dark Pacific water. It is the footprint of a vessel moving at approximately 10 knots. The wake is real. The displacement of water is real. But the ship casting it does not exist. Petrov feels a cold drop of sweat slide down his neck. He picks up the red phone to his superior. This is not a glitch. A glitch does not leave a wake. This is not a submarine surfacing, because a surfaced submarine reflects radar like a floating metal tube. This is a ghost, a massive, displacing object that absorbs radar waves as if they were never sent. The Americans have put a hole in the ocean. Before we dive deeper into this impossible mystery, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We decode the secrets, the spies, and the silent battles that defined a generation. Click that button now. The confusion in Vladivostok is total. In the mid-1980s, the Soviet military doctrine relies entirely on saturation. They know they cannot match American technology dollar for dollar. Instead, they plan to overwhelm American carrier groups with swarms of anti-ship missiles fired from Tu-22 bombers and Oscar-class submarines. To do this, they need one thing: targeting data. They need to know where the enemy is. If the Americans have a ship that the satellites cannot see, the entire Soviet naval strategy collapses. You cannot fire a missile at a ghost. Petrov orders a retasking of the satellite. He demands a wider sweep. Perhaps the coordinates were wrong. Perhaps the ship is 10 miles east. The next pass comes 90 minutes later. The result is even more baffling. This time, the radar picks up something. But it makes no sense. The return signature, the blip on the screen, is tiny. It registers as a small fishing boat, maybe a navigational buoy bobbing in the swells. It is insignificant, a piece of driftwood, but the wake is still there. And now, there is a second anomaly. A US Navy support vessel is tracking alongside the fishing boat. It is a massive ocean-going tug, the kind used to haul oil platforms. The tug is lit up on radar like a Christmas tree. It is moving slowly, protectively, alongside the tiny blip. Why would the United States Navy assign a heavy-duty ocean tug to escort a fishing boat in the middle of the night? Petrov slams his hand on the desk. The logic does not hold. The Americans are hiding something massive inside a radar return that is infinitesimally small. It is a magic trick performed on a global scale. The report travels up the chain of command, from Vladivostok to Moscow. The GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, begins a frantic investigation. They scour the logs of every spy ship, the fishing trawlers bristling with antennas that sit off the US coast. They find a strange pattern in the radio traffic. Usually, when a new American prototype undergoes sea trials, the airwaves are full of encrypted chatter, telemetry data, range safety checks, helicopter pilots talking to the deck. Tonight, the radio spectrum is dead silent. The Americans are maintaining total radio silence. No radar emissions, no radio calls, no navigation lights. Whoever is steering that ghost ship is doing it in pitch blackness, navigating by the stars or passive sensors, terrified of making a sound. This level of secrecy is reserved for nuclear weapons or presidential movements. It is not used for ships. Ships are big, ships are loud, ships are visible. Unless they aren't, days turn into weeks. The ghost of the Pacific appears and disappears at random. Sometimes the Soviet satellites catch a glimpse of the wake. Sometimes they detect that tiny, laughing fishing boat return moving at impossible speeds for a trawler. But they never get a picture. Every time a Soviet Tu-95 Bear reconnaissance aircraft flies too close to the testing zone, the ghost vanishes. It is as if the Americans know exactly when the satellites are overhead. It is as if they know the orbit schedules better than the Soviets do. The paranoia in Moscow grows. Is it a new type of electronic jamming? Is it a submersible aircraft carrier? Then, a field agent in San Diego sends a grainy photograph taken from a public bridge near Long Beach. It is a photo of a barge. A massive, ugly, rusting submersible barge known as the HMB-1. It looks like a floating warehouse, a giant metal box with a roof. The agent reports that the barge only moves at night. It is towed out to sea, sinks down into the water, and something floats out of it. The barge is a cocoon, a hiding place. The Soviets realize they are not looking for a ship that is docked at a pier. They are looking for a ship that lives inside another ship. The HMB-1 is a Trojan horse. During the day, the secret weapon is hidden inside the cavernous belly of the barge, shielded from the prying eyes of the satellites. The roof of the barge blocks the optical cameras. The metal walls block the radar. It is only at night, when the barge is towed to the deep water, that the beast emerges. But what does it look like? The Soviet naval architects try to sketch it based on the radar data. They draw sleek submarines, they draw low-profile speedboats, but nothing explains the fishing boat return. To make a large ship look that small on radar requires a manipulation of physics that Soviet scientists believe is theoretically possible, but engineeringly impossible. It requires stealth. In the 1980s, stealth is a word associated with airplanes. Rumors of the F-117 Nighthawk are just starting to circulate whispers of a black jet in the Nevada desert. But a ship? A ship is a geometry nightmare. It sits on water, which is a perfect reflector. It has a bridge, masts, antennas, railings, deck guns. Every single one of those angles is a radar trap. A corner reflector. To make a ship invisible to radar, you would have to redesign the very concept of a boat from the keel up. You would have to eliminate every right angle. You would have to use materials that do not exist in standard shipbuilding. The cost would be astronomical. The utility would be questionable. Why spend billions to hide a ship when you can just build more submarines? Unless the ship is not just a ship, unless it is a hunter, the Soviet High Command begins to fear the worst scenario. A missile destroyer that can sail right up to the coast of the Kola Peninsula, undetected, and launch a decapitation strike on the Soviet leadership before a single warning siren wails. If the Americans have cracked naval stealth, the Soviet Union's defensive belt, the Bastion strategy, is worthless. The order goes out to the Pacific Fleet. Find the ghost. If you see a wake without a ship, do not ignore it. If you see a fishing boat moving at 20 knots, track it. They need to see the face of the enemy. They need to know if it is a monster or a machine. But out in the dark water, the crew of the Sea Shadow, a name the Soviets do not yet know, is watching the Watchers. They are inside a vessel that defies every tradition of naval history. They are cold, cramped, and seasick, but they are invisible. And they are about to test the limits of their invisibility against the most sophisticated radar network in the East. The game of cat and mouse has begun, but the cat is blindfolded, and the mouse is made of angles that compel the human eye to look away. The mystery deepens not in the middle of the ocean, but in a gritty industrial port in Redwood City, California. To the casual observer, or a Soviet spy driving past in a rented sedan, the facility looks like a graveyard for heavy industry. There are cranes, rust, and the smell of salt water and diesel. But dominating the skyline is that massive barge mentioned in the intelligence reports, the HMB-1. What the Soviet analysts do not yet realize is the pedigree of this barge. The HMB-1 has a history. In the 1970s, this same barge was used by the CIA in Project Azorian, the secret mission to lift a sunken Soviet submarine, the K-129, from the floor of the Pacific. The barge is a veteran of deception. It was built to hide secrets. And now, it is hiding something new. Inside the hollowed-out cavern of the barge, shielded from the sun and the satellites, a team of men is working on a machine that violates every rule of naval architecture. They are not sailors. They are not shipwrights. They are aerodynamicists. This is the twist that Moscow misses. They are looking for a ship designed by the US Navy. But the US Navy did not want this vessel. When the concept was first pitched, admirals laughed. They said, "The sea is not the sky." They said, "You cannot make a ship invisible." So, the Pentagon went to the only people crazy enough to try Lockheed's Skunk Works. These are the same mad scientists who built the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird. They deal in the impossible. And the man leading the charge is Ben Rich, the father of stealth. He brings a radical idea to the table. The same computer algorithms used to shape the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter, a program called Echo, can be applied to a boat. But water is a cruel mistress. It is denser than air. It pounds steel with the force of a sledgehammer. The design that emerges inside the barge is a geometric nightmare. It looks nothing like a boat. It has no curves. It has no conning tower. It has no deck rails. It is a sharp, angular pyramid made of flat, black panels. It looks like an alien artifact or a floating iron. The sides slope inward at a precise 45-degree angle. Why? Because of the corner reflector principle. Major Petrov in Vladivostok knows this principle well. Standard ships are full of 90-degree angles where the wall meets the deck. When a radar wave hits a corner, it bounces twice and shoots straight back to the sender, creating a bright blip. The sea shadow, the ghost inside the barge, has 0 90-degree angles. When a Soviet radar wave hits its sloped side, the energy is deflected upward into space or downward into the water. It is specular reflection. The radar beam glances off like a pebble skipping on a pond. The energy never returns to the enemy receiver. But hiding from radar is only half the battle. The ocean itself is the enemy. The engineers at Skunk Works face a terrifying problem. A flat-sided ship is unstable. In rough seas, it should roll over and sink. To solve this, they steal a radical technology known as SWATH, Small Waterplane Area Twin Hull. The visible part of the sea shadow does not sit in the water, it sits above it. The crew compartment is perched on 2 thin struts. Beneath the surface, deep underwater where the waves cannot reach, are 2 torpedo-like pontoons. These pontoons provide the buoyancy. The ship rides on submerged stilts. It glides over the waves rather than ploughing through them. This explains the strange wake Petrov saw in Part 1. Because the main hull never touches the water, there is no bow wave. There is only the thin, chaotic spray from the struts. The first time they drag the HMB-1 out to sea to unleash the beast, the tension is suffocating. It is the middle of the night. The barge floods its tanks and sinks. The massive door opens. The sea shadow motors out into the Pacific darkness. It is small, only 164 feet long. It carries a crew of just 4 men, a commander, a pilot, a navigator, and an engineer. They sit in a tiny, cramped bridge that looks more like the cockpit of a spaceship than a ship. There are no windows looking forward, only screens. They navigate by camera and sensor. The test begins. The US Navy has positioned a P-3 Orion hunter-killer aircraft overhead. This plane is the apex predator of the ocean. It is stuffed with the most sensitive radar systems in the Western world. Its job is to find the sea shadow. The P-3 pilot radios that he is beginning his sweep. He activates his radar. He expects to see a blip. Silence. The pilot drops lower. He sweeps the sector again. Nothing. The ocean below him registers as empty blackness. "Control, I have no contact," the pilot reports. "Confirm target is in the zone." Down in the cramped bridge of the Sea Shadow, the crew holds their breath. They can hear the drone of the P-3's propellers buzzing overhead. They are sitting ducks, floating on the surface, yet the most advanced radar in the world is looking right through them. The test escalates. The P-3 is ordered to use its infrared sensors. Surely the heat of the engines will show up. But Skunkworks has thought of that too. The diesel-electric engines are buried deep inside the submerged pontoons. The cold seawater acts as a natural radiator, absorbing the heat before it can reach the surface. The exhaust is vented through a diffracted system between the struts, mixing with a spray of cool water mist to hide the thermal signature. To the infrared camera, the Sea Shadow is a black hole. It is actually colder than the surrounding water. The success is terrifying. In fact, it is too successful. During one trial run off the Santa Cruz Islands, the Sea Shadow is maneuvering in a shipping lane. A large commercial tanker is approaching. The tanker is steering by radar, and its radar screen shows an empty ocean. The Sea Shadow commander watches the tanker getting bigger on his own screen. The collision alarm blinks. The tanker is bearing down on them, completely unaware that a 170-ton steel pyramid is directly in its path. "They don't see us," the navigator whispers. The irony is deadly. The stealth technology works so perfectly that it has become a suicide pact. If they stay invisible, they will be crushed. "Light it up," the commander orders. The crew flips a switch. They do not turn on a spotlight. They activate a mechanism designed for this exact moment. Pops up a series of radar reflectors on the mast. Instantly, the Sea Shadow blooms on the tanker's radar. It goes from invisible to the size of an aircraft carrier in a split second. The tanker frantically alters course, missing the stealth ship by a margin of mere yards. The crew exhales. They have proven the concept. They have created a hole in reality. But back in the Soviet Union, the intelligence picture is shifting. The GRU has realized that the Ghost is not a submarine. They have intercepted fragments of communications referring to 9529, the internal code name for the project. They know it is surface-based. They know it comes from the barge. And they know it is rewriting the laws of naval warfare. The Soviet High Command realizes that if the Americans build a fleet of these stealth destroyers, stealth missile cruisers, stealth amphibious assault ships, the Soviet Navy is obsolete. The Bastion defense strategy relies on tracking incoming threats. You cannot defend against what you cannot see until it is 5 miles off your coast. They need to catch it. Not just a blip on a satellite, but the thing itself. Soviet fishing trawlers near California become more aggressive. They start trying to cut across the path of the barge. They deploy divers in the harbors, hoping to get a look at the hull. And inside the Pentagon, a different battle is brewing. The Sea Shadow is a technological marvel, but it is an orphan. The Air Force built it, but the Navy has to buy it. And the Navy admirals are looking at this strange, black, pyramid-shaped thing with suspicion. It is slow, maxing out at 13 knots. It has no armor. One hit from a .50 caliber machine gun would punch right through it. Is it a weapon, or is it a parlor trick? The engineers at Lockheed argue that speed and armor don't matter if the enemy never knows you are there. They argue that this is the future. But to prove it, they have to do something bolder than hiding from a P-3 Orion. They have to prove the Sea Shadow can operate in a war game. They have to hunt a real target. The stage is set for a confrontation. The Sea Shadow is going to be tested against the US Navy's own surface fleet destroyers and frigates with crews who are eager to prove that stealth is a myth. The crew of the IX-529 prepares for a simulated attack run. They are going to try to sink an American Aegis cruiser. If they fail, the program dies. If they succeed, they change warfare forever. But the ocean has one more surprise for them. The structural integrity of the weird A-frame shape is untested in high swells, and a storm is brewing off the coast. The year is 1986. The Pacific Ocean has turned into a violent, churning grey wasteland. A winter storm is hammering the coast of California with 12-foot swells and winds screaming at 40 knots. For a normal destroyer made of hardened steel, this weather is uncomfortable. For the Sea Shadow, it is potentially lethal. The engineers at Lockheed made a critical calculation during the design phase. To keep the ship light enough for the submerged pontoons to support it, they could not use heavy naval armor. They couldn't even use standard ship steel. They used thin, high-tensile steel, more similar to what you would find in an airplane fuselage than a battleship. The welds holding the twin struts to the superstructure are under immense stress. As the ship rides over the massive swells, the two submerged pontoons want to go in different directions. The entire frame of the ship groans. Inside the bridge, the crew of 4 can hear the metal screaming. This is the thrill that the documents do not capture. The fear inside the Sea Shadow is not just about being detected, it is about breaking apart and sinking into the black abyss without anyone ever knowing where they are. But the mission is a go. The US Navy has agreed to the ultimate war game. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser, equipped with the Aegis combat system, is waiting in the testing zone. The Aegis system is the shield of the fleet. It is a computerized beast, capable of tracking hundreds of aerial and surface targets simultaneously. It is designed to stop World War III. The challenge is simple. The Sea Shadow must approach the cruiser, lock its sensors onto it, and simulate a firing solution. If the cruiser detects them first, the Sea Shadow is dead. The crew watches the digital map. The distance closes. 10 miles. 8 miles. On the bridge of the Ticonderoga-class cruiser, the captain is confident. His radar operators are the best in the fleet. They are sweeping the ocean with megawatt-class radar energy. Nothing can get close to them without tripping an alarm. 6 miles. Inside the Sea Shadow, the commander whispers commands. They are riding the wave troughs, using the physical water to mask the tiny amount of noise their struts make. They are a black hole moving through the storm. 4 miles. This is point-blank range in naval warfare. At this distance, the cruiser's deck guns could shred the Sea Shadow in seconds. Target acquired, the Sea Shadow's weapons officer reports. They are not carrying live missiles, but their electronic targeting system has painted the cruiser. They have a lock. In a real war, the cruiser would already be burning. The cruiser's radio remains silent. They have no idea they are dead. The Sea Shadow commander decides to twist the knife. He orders the pilot to bring them closer. They drift in, ghostly and silent, until they are visibly close. They can see the lights of the cruiser through the rain. Then, the commander breaks radio silence on an unsecured channel. USS Cruiser, this is Sea Shadow. We have a firing solution on your bridge. Bang, you're dead. The chaos on the cruiser's bridge is instantaneous. The captain looks out the window. He scans the radar. Nothing. He looks out the window again. He sees nothing but rain and darkness. Say again, unidentified vessel. I hold no contacts. We are off your starboard beam. 2,000 yards. The cruiser crew rushes to the starboard railing with binoculars, and then a lightning flash illuminates the water. For a split second, they see it. A black, angular pyramid, rising from the waves like a sea monster, water cascading off its sloped sides. It is there, and then it is gone. The psychological impact is devastating. The most expensive radar system in the world has just been defeated by a geometry trick. The US Navy admirals who called it a toy are silenced. The Sea Shadow is not just a concept, it is a predator. But while the Americans are playing war games, the Soviets are playing for keeps. A Soviet fishing trawler, the Primorye, has been lurking on the edge of the exclusion zone for weeks. It is stuffed with GRU signals intelligence officers. They did not see the Sea Shadow on radar, but they heard the radio transmission. They heard the American cruiser panic. The Soviet intelligence apparatus realizes that the Americans have achieved first strike capability at sea. If a ship can get that close to an Aegis cruiser undetected, it can get that close to a Soviet harbor. It can deploy Navy SEALs. It can launch cruise missiles. Moscow authorizes a desperate measure. They need physical evidence. They need to know what the material is. Is it a special paint? Is it a force field? The order goes out to Soviet assets in the Pacific. Intercept. The twist comes 2 nights later. The Sea Shadow is returning to the HMB-1 barge. The weather has calmed, but the fog is thick. The crew is exhausted. They are maneuvering slowly toward the extraction point. Suddenly, the passive sonar picks up a high-speed screw noise. A vessel is closing in fast from the west. It is not a US Navy support boat. The acoustic signature is wrong. It is a commercial engine pushed to its limit. It is a Soviet-flagged merchant ship that has accidentally veered miles off course, heading straight for the coordinates where the barge is waiting. The Sea Shadow is trapped. It has no weapons. It has no speed. Its top speed is 13 knots. The merchant ship is doing 18. If the merchant ship gets within visual range, They will photograph the hull. Or worse, they might try to ram it, forcing a rescue operation where Soviet sailors can board the wreck. The Sea Shadow commander has to make a split-second choice. He cannot outrun them, he cannot shoot them, he has to vanish. All stop. Drifting mode, he orders. The Sea Shadow cuts its engines. The crew kills all the interior lights. They sit in the pitch blackness of the cockpit, floating silently in the path of the oncoming freighter. The Soviet ship is hunting by radar. They are looking for the barge. They don't know the Sea Shadow is already in the water, floating right in front of them. The massive steel bow of the merchant ship looms out of the fog. It is terrifyingly huge. It is heading straight for them. The Soviet captain is searching for the HMB-1, unaware that he is about to run over $1 billion of secret technology. The crew of the Sea Shadow braces for impact. They are going to be crushed. At the last possible second, literally 100 yards away, the merchant ship alters course. Not because they saw the Sea Shadow, but because they spotted the radar reflection of the barge 3 miles further back. They turn to chase the bigger target. The wake of the merchant ship hits the Sea Shadow violently. The stealth ship rocks dangerously, dipping its sharp nose into the water, groaning under the stress. They survive by inches. The merchant ship circles the barge, taking photos, aggressive and hungry. But the bird has already flown, or rather, floated. The Sea Shadow slips away in the opposite direction, invisible in the chaos of the merchant ship's own wake. This close call changes everything. The Pentagon realizes that the secret is leaking. The Soviets are getting too bold. The ocean is too open. They need to take the Sea Shadow somewhere where no Soviet satellite or trawler can reach it. They need to test it during the daylight. But how do you hide a black pyramid in the middle of the day? You don't. You change the game entirely. The Sea Shadow is about to be pulled from the water and vanished. But the technology it proved, the angular designs, the radar-absorbent materials, is about to be transferred to a new generation of monsters. However, there is one final, shocking flaw in the Sea Shadow design. A flaw that the Soviets were beginning to suspect, and one that would ultimately doom the ship to be a one-off prototype rather than the first of a fleet. It wasn't the radar. It wasn't the speed. It was the wake. Wait, didn't we say there was no wake? That was true for the hull. But the satellites in Part 1 saw something, a scar. The scientists discover that while the ship doesn't make a wave, it leaves a thermal scar on the water surface. The friction of the struts moving through the water heats up the ocean by a fraction of a degree. And in 1987, the Soviet Union launches a new satellite equipped with a hypersensitive infrared scanner capable of detecting temperature changes of 0.1 degrees. The ghost is about to be unmasked. The shock that ultimately kills the Sea Shadow program does not come from a Soviet missile. It comes from a physics textbook. By 1987, the Soviet Union is crumbling economically, but its scientific community remains brilliant. While their radar networks are being baffled by the Sea Shadow's angular geometry, their fluid dynamics experts are looking at something else. They are studying the Kelvin wake. This is the fatal flaw that the Skunk Works engineers battled against but could never fully defeat. Any ship displaces water. Even a swath vessel like the Sea Shadow, riding on submerged pontoons, must push water out of the way to move forward. When water is disturbed, it changes structure. The mixing of the layers brings cold water from the depths to the surface or churns the surface water into a froth. This creates a scar on the ocean's surface. The Sea Shadow is invisible to radar. It is nearly silent to sonar. It is cold to standard infrared. But to a new generation of synthetic aperture radar satellites and hypersensitive interferometric scanners, that wake looks like a highway. The satellite does not need to see the ship. It sees the trail of different water left behind. It detects the subtle change in wave patterns that persist for miles behind the vessel. The Soviets realize, we don't need to find the needle, we just need to find where the hay has been disturbed. This realization sends a chill through the Pentagon. The invincibility of the stealth ship is an illusion. It works against the technology of 1980, but it is vulnerable to the technology of 1990. The margin of safety is evaporating. But there is a second, more pragmatic shock waiting for the Sea Shadow. The US Navy admirals finally get a good look at the operational data. They see a ship that is invisible, yes, but they also see a ship that is practically useless in a real shooting war. The pyramid shape is great for deflecting radar, but it is terrible for carrying weapons. The internal volume of the Sea Shadow is tiny. The angled walls encroach on the deck space. There is no room for a vertical launch missile system. There is no room for a large crew. There is no room for a helicopter hangar. The Sea Shadow is a one-trick pony. It can hide, but it cannot fight. If the US Navy were to build a fleet of these, they would have a navy of ninjas that could sneak into enemy waters and do what? They couldn't carry enough cruise missiles to destroy a base. They couldn't carry enough supplies to stay at sea for months. The shock is economic. The cost to build a weaponized version of the Sea Shadow, one big enough to actually be a destroyer, would be astronomical. And it would still be vulnerable to a simple wake detection satellite. So, the decision is made. The program is frozen. The Sea Shadow is not sent to war. It is not mass-produced. It is shoved back into the dark belly of the HMB-1 barge and left to rot. For 6 years it sits there, a billion-dollar secret gathering dust. The Berlin Wall falls. The Soviet Union collapses. The Cold War ends. The ghost of the Pacific becomes a relic of a war that never happened. Then, in 1993, the United States decides to do the unthinkable. They decide to reveal the magician's trick. The public is stunned. On April 11th, 1993, the HMB-1 barge is towed out into the daylight, and the Sea Shadow emerges not at night, but in the glaring sun. It sails under the Golden Gate Bridge. The world gasps. To the public, it looks like something from another planet. It looks like an origami boat made of obsidian. Newspapers run headlines asking if this is UFO technology. It looks so futuristic that the producers of the James Bond franchise see the photos and are immediately inspired. In the film Tomorrow Never Dies, the villain's stealth ship is a direct copy of the Sea Shadow. The fiction catches up to the reality, but the reality is much sadder. The Sea Shadow spends the next decade as a floating museum piece and a test bed for future technologies. It is used to test new coatings and automation systems, but it never sails on a real mission. It never hunts a Russian submarine again. By 2006, the Navy is tired of paying for the barge's dock fees. The ghost is now just a line item in a budget report that someone wants to delete. They try to give it away. The Navy offers the Sea Shadow to any museum that wants it. Free, they say. Take the world's first stealth ship. But there is a catch. The Navy refuses to give away the classified technology inherent in the ship's construction, and the chemical coatings on the hull are toxic. Any museum taking it would have to pay millions to maintain it in an environmentally safe way. No one wants it. The Smithsonian passes. The Intrepid Museum passes. The ship that terrified the Soviet Union sits unwanted in Suisun Bay, part of the mothball fleet, slowly rusting alongside World War II cargo ships. Then comes the final insult. In 2012, the US Navy decides that the Sea Shadow has to go. They put it up for auction. But this is not an auction for a collector. It is a dismantling contract. The terms of the sale are brutal. The buyer must destroy the ship. It cannot be preserved. It cannot be sold to a foreign power. It must be cut into scrap metal within the United States borders, under Navy supervision. The auction closes. The winning bid is $2.5 million, but that is not the price for the ship alone. That includes the massive HMB-1 barge. The barge is valuable. The barge can be used for other things. The Sea Shadow, the stealth ship itself, is effectively valued at zero. It is just scrap steel. The winning company is Bay Ship and Yacht Company in Alameda, California. The final scene of the Sea Shadow's life is tragic. It is towed into a dry dock. Giant hydraulic claws. The dinosaurs of the scrapyard move in. There is something visceral about watching a machine that looks like it belongs in the year 2050 being torn apart by crude industrial shears. The claws rip into the black radar-absorbent panels. The tumble-home hull, the secret geometry that confused the finest minds in the Kremlin, is crunched like a soda can. Workers with cutting torches slice through the struts. The bridge, where the commander once simulated sinking an Aegis cruiser, is turned into a pile of molten slag. The Soviet satellites could never destroy the Sea Shadow. The Pacific storms could not sink it. In the end, it was destroyed by the very nation that built it, sold for the price of scrap metal. But wait, is the ghost really dead? As the Sea Shadow is being cut apart in California, On the other side of the country, at Bath Iron Works in Maine, a new keel is being laid. The US Navy has authorized the construction of the DDG-1000, the Zumwalt-class destroyer. If you look at the Zumwalt, you see a ghost. It has the same inward-sloping sides, it has the same tumble-home hull, it has the same composite deckhouse hidden from radar. It is massive 15,000 tons, but on a radar screen it looks like a small fishing boat. The DNA of the Sea Shadow did not die in the scrapyard, it was transplanted. The Sea Shadow was a technology demonstrator. Its job was never to fight. Its job was to prove that the impossible was possible. It proved the air inside the Gaz-24 Volga was thick with the taste of cheap tobacco and stale boredom. It was a Tuesday in the late autumn of 1982, and Moscow was a city of grey concrete under a grey sky. For the three-man team from the KGB's 7th Directorate, this was just another day on the clock, another rotation in the endless, grinding business of watching. Their target was a mid-level diplomat attached to the American embassy, a man whose life they knew in excruciating detail. They knew his brand of toothpaste, the time he left for work down to the minute, and the frequency of his arguments with his wife. He was predictable. He was manageable. He was like every other foreigner in this city, a specimen under glass. Their confidence was not arrogance, it was doctrine. Moscow was their fortress. It was a perfectly designed prison for the unwary, a web of surveillance so total, so absolute, that the very idea of a secret was an absurdity. Every street corner had its watchers, every grand hotel its listening posts. The 7th Directorate, the masters of this domain, were the gold standard of state security. They had eyes on everything and everyone. They were the heirs to a system that had humbled the high-flying U-2 spy plane, a victory that had become a foundational myth for their service. They believed, with the certainty of religious faith, that nothing moved within the city's arteries without their knowledge and permission. Their operational manual was thick with triumphs. Its pages on failure were blank. The American Sedan, a Ford with diplomatic plates that made it stand out like a sore thumb, proceeded along the Kutuzovsky Prospect, its movements logged with mechanical precision by the lead surveillance car. The driver, a veteran named Victor, kept a professional distance, blending into the sluggish traffic. In the passenger seat, the team leader, Mikhail, spoke quietly into a concealed microphone, his voice a low monotone reporting their position. In the back, the third man scanned the sidewalks, his eyes cataloguing every pedestrian who lingered a moment too long. It was a ballet of paranoia, choreographed to perfection. The American car signaled a right turn onto a smaller, less trafficked side street. It was on the target's regular route home, another box checked, another predictable move. Victor eased the Volga around the corner a few seconds later, the ideal interval to avoid suspicion. He expected to see the Ford's taillights halfway down the block. But they weren't there. The street was empty, save for a few parked Moskvich sedans and an old woman sweeping the pavement. Victor blinked. He slowed the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Mikhail finished his transmission and looked up, his face clouding with confusion. "Where is he?" "He turned right here," Victor insisted, his voice tight. "I saw him. Stop the car." The command was sharp. Mikhail was out in an instant, scanning the intersecting alleyways. Nothing. The backseat observer joined him. They looked at each other, a cold knot of dread tightening in their stomachs. A car simply does not vanish from a straight, empty street in the heart of Moscow. It was a violation of the laws of physics, a flagrant insult to the reality they controlled. Mikhail grabbed the radio. "Team 2, do you have eyes? Team 3, status." The replies crackled back, each one a hammer blow of negation. No one had seen the Ford emerge from the far end of the street. No one had seen it pull over. The car, and its American occupant, had entered the block and ceased to exist. For the first time in his decorated career, Mikhail felt a sensation he couldn't identify. It was a mixture of bewilderment and a deeply personal, chilling sense of violation. It was as if a ghost had walked through the walls of their fortress, not by blowing them down, but by simply choosing to ignore their existence. In the suffocating silence of that Moscow side street, the myth of the impenetrable wall had just developed its first, terrifying crack. If you enjoy exploring the hidden battles of the Cold War, subscribe for more content on its lasting impact. To understand the depth of the KGB's shock, you must first understand the city they had built. Post-war Moscow was not just a capital, it was a statement. It was the heart of a world empire and the central nervous system of a global ideology. The KGB, and specifically its 7th Directorate, was tasked with keeping that heart pure and that system secure. They approached this with a uniquely Russian combination of methodical patience and overwhelming force. Thousands of plainclothes agents, known as toptuni or foot sloggers, were assigned to physical surveillance. Their job was to follow, to watch, and to report. They were backed by fleets of dedicated surveillance cars, some disguised as taxis or delivery vans, all linked by a sophisticated radio network. This human element was layered with a technological one. Key intersections were monitored. The phones of every foreigner were tapped as a matter of course. Their apartments were bugged, their trash was analyzed, their mail was read. The local Russian staff at every embassy were either direct KGB employees or coerced informants. The result was a suffocating 360-degree panopticon. For a CIA officer operating in this environment, it was like trying to perform surgery in a brightly lit arena, surrounded by a hostile and infinitely patient audience. Every meeting with a Russian asset, every exchange of information, carried the risk of immediate arrest, imprisonment, or worse. The system was designed to make meaningful espionage impossible. The KGB's victory over the CIA's U-2 spy plane program in 1960 had cemented this belief. They had proven that even America's most advanced technology could be brought down to earth. What hope did a lone man on the street have? On the other side of the world, in Langley, Virginia, this was the central problem. The U-2 had given them a god's-eye view, but its loss created a critical intelligence vacuum. They needed human sources, men and women on the inside of the Soviet military and intelligence apparatus. But how could a case officer meet with an asset when he had a dedicated KGB team following him every time he left the embassy gates? How could he pass a message or receive a roll of film when every move he made was being documented and analyzed? The traditional methods of espionage, the brush pass in the park, the chalk mark on the wall, had become suicidal gambles. The KGB was too good, the surveillance too total. The Americans were, for all intents and purposes, locked in a box. The solution came not from a new piece of high-tech satellite hardware, but from a small, discreet group of technical wizards within the CIA's Office of Technical Services. These were not spies in the traditional sense. They were illusionists, craftsmen, and psychological engineers. Their job was to create gadgets and techniques that could beat the system, not by overpowering it, but by outthinking it. They understood a fundamental weakness in the KGB's monolithic approach. It relied on predictability and human assumptions. The Soviet watchers expected their targets to behave in certain ways. They were trained to observe, but they were also trained to see what they expected to see. And in that gap between observation and expectation, there was room for magic. The problem was simple. A case officer needed to become two people. One person who was being followed by the KGB, and another, invisible person who could move freely. The solution they devised was audacious in its simplicity. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, a device that had no official name but came to be known colloquially as the Jack-in-the-Box. It wasn't an explosive device, but a spring-loaded mannequin, a collapsible human form. An OTS technician would spend weeks studying photographs and films of a specific case officer. They would replicate his exact height, his build, his posture. They would create a latex mask of his face, perfect down to the last wrinkle and mole, and fit it with a wig of his own hair. This dummy would be dressed in an identical set of clothes, the same coat, the same scarf, the same hat. The entire apparatus could be compressed into a small bundle and hidden inside a modified car seat or a false-bottomed briefcase. On a signal, the case officer, sitting in the passenger seat of a car driven by a trusted colleague, would activate the device. In a fraction of a second, the dummy would spring up into the seat, perfectly mimicking his posture. To the KGB surveillance team 100 meters back, it would appear as though nothing had changed. At the exact moment the dummy deployed, the real case officer, hidden for a split second by the car's motion during a sharp turn, would slip out of the specially modified passenger door and melt into the crowd, wearing a completely different set of clothes he had on underneath his top layer. The car would proceed on its predictable route, with a dummy in the passenger seat, leading the KGB on a wild goose chase. Meanwhile, the real officer was free. He was a ghost. He was the phantom that had just walked out of the KGB's prison. The radio in Mikhail's hand felt like a block of ice. The professional calm he had cultivated over a decade of service was evaporating, replaced by a raw, corrosive panic. Around him, the machinery of the 7th Directorate was grinding into high gear, but it was a machine designed to track, not to find something that had winked out of existence. More teams were converging on their position, their tires squealing around corners, their presence shattering the quiet afternoon. But they were converging on a vacuum, a geographic point where reality had momentarily bent. All units, establish a perimeter. A senior controller's voice barked over the net, the strain audible even through the crackle. Seal a 10-block radius. Check all garages, all courtyards. He could have pulled over. But Mikhail knew he hadn't. He had seen the Ford. It was moving at a steady pace. It had made the turn and then nothing. The hypothesis of a simple stop didn't fit the facts. This was something else. This was a deliberate act, a sleight of hand performed on a city-sized stage. He felt his authority slipping away, his team's perfect record dissolving into confusion and shouted questions. Victor was pacing by the Volga, chain-smoking, his eyes darting down every alley. The younger agent was useless, staring into the middle distance, as if trying to will the American car back into being. The hunt was on, but it was a chase against a ghost. Reports flooded the command net. A car matching the description was spotted near Gorky Park, false alarm. Another was seen heading toward the outer ring road, a different diplomatic vehicle. For the next 2 hours, the KGB's surveillance network, the pride of the Soviet state, thrashed and flailed like a beast caught in an invisible net. They were chasing a memory. They were hunting a phantom conjured from a single moment of impossibility. All the while, the controller's voice grew tighter, the questions from superiors more pointed. How could a car simply disappear? Where was the team? What was their visual status? To each query, Mikhail had to repeat the same humiliating answer: no visual. We are searching. Miles away, the man they were searching for walked calmly through the glittering halls of the gum department store opposite Red Square. His name was Jack Downing, and he was the CIA's deputy chief of station in Moscow. The heavy overcoat and hat he had worn in the car were gone, stuffed into a disposable bag. He now wore a simple tweed jacket and glasses, looking for all the world like a mildly curious German tourist. The frantic radio chatter, the screeching tires, the spreading panic, all of it was a world away. He felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, but it was cold and controlled, the feeling of a professional at work. His heart rate was steady. He checked his watch. He had a 45-minute window. He browsed a display of fur hats, picked one up, examined the stitching, and put it back. He was not being followed. He had checked 3 times using the reflections in the shop windows, his movements casual, practiced, and utterly invisible to the untrained eye. The KGB's entire focus was on a Ford sedan driving placidly across the city, its occupants a calm embassy driver and a silent, motionless passenger obeying every traffic law. Downing, the real target, had become a nobody, a face in the crowd, and in the Soviet Union, a nobody was the one person the system was not designed to see. He exited the department store and made his way to a pre-arranged park bench. An elderly Russian man was sitting there reading a copy of Pravda. The man did not look up. Downing sat at the other end of the bench, opened a book, and began to read. After 5 minutes, he closed the book, leaving a small palm-sized package tucked within its pages. He stood up and walked away without a backward glance. The old man waited another 2 minutes, then folded his newspaper, picked up the book as if it had been forgotten, and ambled off in the opposite direction. The package in his hands contained a miniature camera, new encryption codes, and a one-time pad for secure communications. The man was Adolf Tolkachev, a high-ranking engineer in a Soviet aviation design bureau and the CIA's most valuable asset inside the USSR. He was a billion-dollar spy, and Downing had just met him right under the KGB's nose, while their entire security apparatus was chasing a dummy in a car. The chase ended unceremoniously 4 hours after it began. The target Ford sedan, having led multiple KGB teams on a scenic tour of Moscow's suburbs, finally returned to the American embassy compound and disappeared into the underground garage. The game was over. The KGB team set up their usual static surveillance posts around the embassy perimeter, their mission a catastrophic failure. The official report would be a nightmare to write. But for the local KGB station chief, a man whose career was now hanging by a thread, this was not enough. The humiliation was too profound, the mystery too galling. He needed to know how. He made a call, pulling strings that went to the very top of the foreign ministry. An official protest was lodged, an accusation of gross violation of diplomatic protocol was fabricated. Under the guise of this diplomatic complaint, a team of senior KGB officers, accompanied by ministry officials, were granted access to the embassy garage to inspect the vehicle. They found the Ford parked in its designated spot. The team leader, a grim-faced KGB colonel, walked toward it, his men fanning out behind him. An American Marine guard watched them with a bored expression, chewing gum. The driver's side was empty. The colonel peered into the passenger side window, his breath fogging the cold glass. And then he saw it. Sitting upright in the passenger seat was a mannequin. It was dressed in the diplomat's coat and hat, its latex face a grotesque, lifeless parody of a human being. The colonel stared, his mind refusing to process the information. He slowly opened the door. The dummy's head lolled to one side with a faint squeak of plastic on vinyl. It was a doll, a puppet. All of it, the frantic chase, the perimeter, the dozens of agents, the hundreds of man-hours, the panicked calls to superiors, all of it had been in pursuit of a toy. The silence in the garage was absolute. In that moment, the event transformed from a simple operational failure into an act of profound psychological warfare. This wasn't just an escape. It was a joke at their expense. It was a calculated act of contempt. The Americans had not used some exotic billion-dollar technology to defeat them. They had used a trick worthy of a stage magician, a piece of theatrical absurdity. They had treated the KGB's fearsome, all-seeing surveillance state as a joke, a clumsy beast to be easily misdirected with a simple puppet show. The colonel felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. This was not a defeat. It was a humiliation. It was a message. The message was that the Americans believed they could operate with impunity in the heart of Moscow, not through force, but through a quiet, galling display of intellectual superiority. They were mocking the very foundation of the KGB's power, and the sting of that mockery would be felt all the way to the top. The incident of the mannequin in the embassy garage was not recorded as a strategic defeat. In the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the KGB, it was classified as an operational anomaly, a bizarre but singular failure attributed to the incompetence of Mikhail's team and an audacious American trick. The official report was buried under a mountain of paperwork. The lesson, for the directorate, was to be more vigilant, to add a fourth car to the surveillance detail, to shorten the allowable distance between the watchers and the watched. They reinforced the walls of the fortress, believing they had plugged a unique, isolated hole. They were wrong. This was not a hole, it was a door. And the Americans had the key. A few months later, it happened again. A different American diplomat, a different street, a different time of day. The KGB team, hyper alert after the first incident, was running a tighter formation, close enough to read the license plate. The target's car took a sharp turn into a covered parking structure. The lead KGB car followed less than 5 seconds behind. When it entered the echoing concrete cavern, the American car was already cruising toward the exit on the other side. The surveillance continued, a perfect textbook follow. Except, when the American diplomat supposedly returned to the embassy hours later, the real man had been photographed by a static observation post, having coffee across town. The man in the car was another puppet. The impossible had happened again. This time, it could not be dismissed. A pattern was emerging. The Americans weren't just getting lucky, they had developed a system. They had turned the streets of Moscow into a grand stage for a recurring magic trick, and the KGB was the unwilling, perpetually baffled audience. The realization sent a tremor of cold dread through the 7th Directorate's headquarters at Dzerzhinsky Square. Their doctrine was predicated on total control, but how could they control an enemy who could become invisible at will? They were no longer the predators, stalking their prey. They were guards in a prison from which the most important inmates could simply vanish for hours at a time, leaving a dummy in their cell before returning as if nothing had happened. The question was no longer if it would happen again, but when and what damage would be done during those stolen hours of freedom. The system was refined and deployed for the highest stakes operations. Consider the case of Gija, a source deep within the Soviet Ministry of Defense who had access to top-secret missile specifications. For months, the CIA had no safe way to retrieve the physical intelligence he had gathered. Any meeting was a death sentence. The risk of passing a physical package, a canister of film, was astronomical. The jack-in-the-box was the only answer. On a snowy afternoon in the 1980s, the designated CIA case officer left the embassy, his KGB escort falling into their now paranoid tight formation. The route took them past the sprawling Izmailovsky market, a chaotic sea of people. The officer's car momentarily disappeared behind a large municipal bus. In that 2-second window of total occlusion, the switch was made. The dummy sprang up, and the real officer, now dressed as a working-class Russian in a fur ushanka and worn coat, slipped out of the car and was instantly swallowed by the crowd. While the KGB tailed a puppet on a predictable route, the real officer navigated the market's maze-like paths to a pre-arranged dead drop, a hollowed-out brick in a crumbling wall. He retrieved the film canister from Geiger and replaced it with a new set of instructions and a payment of cash. 37 minutes later, he was picked up by a different embassy vehicle at a discreet location and returned to the compound. The intelligence he retrieved was a massive strategic coup for the West. The KGB, reviewing their surveillance logs, noted only that the target had gone directly from the embassy to a diplomatic reception and back. Their records showed a perfect, unbroken chain of observation. But their records were a lie. This systematic success bred a new level of audacity. It wasn't just about collecting intelligence anymore, it was about managing their most precious assets. When Adolf Tolkachev, the spy codenamed CK-Sphere, who was providing blueprints for the next generation of Soviet fighter jets and radar systems, needed a face-to-face meeting to resolve a complex technical question, Langley approved the unthinkable: a personal meeting in the heart of the enemy's capital. Using the same technique, Jack Downing vanished from the KGB's view, met Tolkachev on a crowded commuter train, and for 20 minutes they sat side by side, speaking in low tones as the train rattled through Moscow's suburbs. They looked like two ordinary Russians discussing the price of bread. It was an act of operational artistry and pure nerve, made possible only by the system that allowed the CIA to punch a hole in reality whenever they needed to. With each successful operation, the psychological impact on the KGB deepened. The Americans had created more than just a tactical advantage. They had created a symbol. It wasn't a physical thing like a high-flying plane or a silent submarine. It was an absence. It was the moment of disappearance itself. Among the analysts in the 7th Directorate, it became known as the gap. It was the blank space on the surveillance tape, the jump in the time-stamped photos, the single, inexplicable second when the quarry was there, and then he was not. This gap became a haunting element, a ghost in their machine. Senior KGB officers would spend sleepless nights in screening rooms, replaying the footage of the moments leading up to a disappearance. They would watch the target's car make a turn, follow it with their own, and then stare at the empty street on the other side. They sought a rational explanation, but there was none. The event itself was a direct assault on their worldview, which was grounded in a materialist, predictable reality. Ghosts, they believed, did not exist. The gap began to breed a corrosive paranoia within the ranks. If the Americans could vanish, was it a failure of technology or a failure of men? Surveillance teams were broken up, their members reassigned to frigid outposts in Siberia, their careers ruined by the suspicion that they had been sloppy, or worse, complicit. Polygraph tests were administered relentlessly. A culture of profound distrust began to fester. Team leaders began to suspect their own drivers. Controllers began to suspect their team leaders. The Americans had found a way to weaponize uncertainty. The gap was not just a blind spot in their surveillance, it was a symbol of their enemy's seemingly magical ability to operate beyond the known laws of their universe. It suggested an intellectual and imaginative superiority that was, to the rigid Soviet mindset, more terrifying than any missile or tank. It was a constant, unnerving reminder that for all their manpower and all their control, the KGB was being systematically, routinely, and contemptuously outwitted. The reports could no longer be buried. The persistent, nagging anomaly of the gap had metastasized into a full-blown strategic crisis. The evidence was undeniable and deeply alarming. On multiple occasions, American case officers who were under what should have been hermetic surveillance were inexplicably reappearing in operational debriefs with fresh intelligence. A new Soviet air-to-air missile specification, known only to a handful of men in a top-secret design bureau, would suddenly inform NATO defense policy. A transcript of a private Politburo debate would be quoted, almost verbatim, in a Radio Free Europe broadcast. The intelligence was too accurate, too timely, and too damaging to be a coincidence. It was flowing out of the Soviet Union's most secure institutions, and the KGB, the state's sword and shield, had no idea how. The realization finally reached the highest levels. In a tense meeting in the wood-paneled offices of the KGB chairman, the situation was laid bare. It wasn't about a single trick or a faulty team anymore. The Americans had established a reliable, repeatable method for breaking the 7th Directorate's control. They were operating a clandestine railroad, and it ran straight through the heart of Moscow. For the men in that room, men who had built their careers on the principle of absolute control, this was an existential threat. It was a cancer on their authority. The problem demanded a solution, not an excuse. The Soviet system, when faced with a complex problem, rarely responded with subtlety. Its instinct was to apply overwhelming mass. If a nail wouldn't go in, you didn't look for a better hammer. You brought in a steam-powered pile driver. The answer to the CIA's surgical precision was to be a campaign of brute force suppression. The countermeasure was given a code name, Operation Zaslon, or Barrier. The goal was simple and absolute: to create a surveillance net so dense, so total, and so physically inescapable that the gap could not possibly be created. Zaslon was the physical manifestation of the state's full paranoia. The standard 3-car tail on a high-value CIA target was tripled. Now, a convoy of 9, sometimes 12, unmarked KGB vehicles would shadow the Americans' every move. The convoy included crash cars, designed to block intersections, mobile listening posts to monitor any conceivable transmission, and vehicles packed with agents ready to deploy on foot in seconds. An observation helicopter was often added to the mix, its rotors beating a constant, ominous rhythm over the city, tracking the target car from above. The human element was scaled up to an almost absurd degree. At every major intersection along a target's known routes, teams of top tunie were pre-positioned, lurking in doorways and cafes, ready to pick up a visual if the target ever left his vehicle. The goal was to create a 360-degree bubble of constant observation, leaving no blind spots, no moments of occlusion, no possible window for a trick. The cost was astronomical, the manpower drain immense. It was the KGB's big bet, a declaration that they would smother their enemy with the sheer, inexhaustible weight of the state. And it was a catastrophic failure. The architects of Operation Zaslon had made a fundamental error. They believed they were fighting a physical battle of observation and maneuver. In reality, the Americans were fighting a psychological battle of perception and assumption. The CIA's jack-in-the-box system was never about outrunning the KGB, it was about outthinking them. And the KGB's brute force response only made them more predictable, more cumbersome, and ultimately easier to defeat. The first reason for its failure was the sheer unsustainability of the effort. The CIA station in Moscow had dozens of officers. The KGB could not possibly mount a 12-car, 1 helicopter, 50-man surveillance operation on every single one of them, 24 hours a day. It was operationally and logistically impossible. The Americans quickly realized this. They began to use their less critical officers as decoys, sending them on pointless but official-looking errands across Moscow. The KGB, forced to guess which target was genuine, would inevitably commit the massive Zaslon package to the wrong car, leaving the real case officer with only a light, standard tail that could be beaten with the original, simpler techniques. The KGB's greatest strength, its immense size, was turned against it, forcing it to exhaust itself chasing shadows. Secondly, the countermeasure destroyed the one thing a surveillance operation needs to succeed: subtlety. A convoy of 12 black Volga sedans and a helicopter is not covert. It screams secret police. This overt aggression was a gift to the Americans. It served as an unambiguous signal, confirming precisely when and where the KGB was focusing its maximum effort. The CIA could now use the deployment of Zaslon itself as a tool to map out the KGB's priorities and vulnerabilities. They could intentionally trigger a massive response in one district simply to draw resources away from a real operation happening in another. Finally, the core deception became even more effective. The CIA adapted. Knowing the intensity of the surveillance, they understood that the moment of the swap was now the point of maximum danger, so they refined it. Instead of a simple exit from a car door, they engineered more complex scenarios. In one case, an embassy car entered a multi-story parking garage. A second, identical car was already waiting inside. The Zaslon team, forced to follow the first car up the spiraling ramp, lost visual for the crucial 15 seconds it took for the target car to round a concrete pillar. In that window, the case officer switched cars. The KGB team, fixated on the original vehicle, followed it out of the garage and across the city, never realizing their target was now in a different car, heading in the opposite direction. They were so focused on creating a barrier of overwhelming force around the initial target that they failed to consider the possibility of the target itself changing form. The definitive proof of Zaslon's failure is not found in a single dramatic event, but in the cold, hard data of intelligence collection. Consider the killer statistic. During the nearly 2 years that Operation Zaslon was at its peak, a period when the KGB was dedicating unprecedented resources to sealing the city, Langley registered a 40% increase in high-grade intelligence reports from its Moscow station. During that same period, Adolf Tolkachev, Sphere, successfully passed over 24 separate packages of top-secret documents on Soviet avionics. The KGB's official log of confirmed clandestine meetings for that period, 0. They had spent millions of rubles, deployed thousands of agents, and grounded their entire operational philosophy on a system that not only failed to stop the intelligence bleed, but actually made it worse. The psychological toll on the KGB was devastating. This was not a simple defeat. It was a repudiation of their entire method. They had responded to the enemy's ingenuity with brute force. And that force had proven to be clumsy, stupid, and ineffective. A deep, corrosive cynicism began to set in among the officers of the 7th Directorate. They were trapped in a futile exercise, mounting massive, expensive operations they knew were likely being misdirected. The gap was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was an accepted, galling feature of their work. The Americans, it seemed, could do as they pleased. The feeling of helplessness bred resentment and fatalism. The impenetrable fortress had been shown to have invisible doors, and even when they put all their guards on one door, the enemy simply walked out another. The failure of Zaslon was a quiet internal collapse, an admission that they were locked in a game whose rules they didn't fully understand, against an opponent who seemed to be playing in a different dimension entirely. The failure of Operation Zaslon was more than a tactical embarrassment. It was an ideological verdict. It was a perfect, contained experiment that exposed the fatal flaw at the very heart of the Soviet system. When faced with a problem of American ingenuity, the KGB's response was not to innovate, but to escalate. Their solution was to apply more mass, more pressure, more raw, physical force. They brought a sledgehammer to a surgical procedure. This reflex to solve every problem with overwhelming, brute force materialism was not unique to the 7th Directorate. It was the guiding principle of their entire command economy, from the tank factories of the Urals to the wheat farms of Ukraine. The system was built to imitate and to scale, not to invent. It could copy a B-29 bomber bolt for bolt, but it struggled to create the dynamic, risk-taking environment that could imagine it in the first place. The CIA's Jack-in-the-Box, by contrast, was the product of a different world, a different philosophy. It was not a weapon forged in a vast, state-run arsenal. It was a piece of bespoke craftsmanship, born in a small, quiet workshop in Langley. It was the child of intellectual freedom, conceived by a handful of technicians who were empowered to challenge assumptions and think asymmetrically. They did not try to build a car that could outrun the KGB's Vulgus. They asked a more fundamental question: how do we beat the mind of the man watching us? Their solution attacked the psychology of the observer, not the physics of the chase. This was the critical difference, the ideological chasm that separated the two superpowers. One system relied on the freedom of the individual mind to create elegant, efficient solutions to complex problems. The other relied on the power of the state to impose crude, massive solutions, hoping to crush complexity under its sheer weight. The empty streets of Moscow, where KGB convoys hunted for ghosts, became the proving ground. The verdict was clear: agility would always triumph over mass, and innovation would always outwit imitation. The KGB's failure was a microcosm of the Soviet Union's larger, slow-motion collapse, a failure of the imagination. This systemic failure, this bankruptcy of ideas, could not remain a secret forever. For decades, the illusion of monolithic power was maintained by walls, both real and metaphorical. The greatest of these was the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the brute force solution. It was the physical manifestation of the Soviet belief that you could control a population, an idea, a historical tide, by simply building a barrier strong enough and high enough, and posting enough guards with guns to watch it. It was Operation Zaslon on a continental scale. For the people living in its shadow, It was the daily, concrete proof of their system's fundamental weakness. It was a prison that had to hold its own people captive to survive. Then came the night of November 9th, 1989, the ultimate demonstration. On the floodlit ramparts of the wall, the border guards of the German Democratic Republic, men trained in the same rigid, unthinking doctrine as the KGB watchers in Moscow, found themselves facing a situation for which their manuals had no answer. A crowd had gathered, not with weapons but with questions. They were not attacking the wall, they were simply ignoring it. They were challenging its reality, its authority, its very reason for being. The guards had the guns, the watchtowers, the overwhelming force. They could have opened fire. But in that moment the brute force solution was revealed for what it was, a hollow and fragile bluff. Against the sheer moral force of a people who had decided they were no longer afraid, the guns were useless. The guards stood down, the gates were opened, and the people poured through. The stream became a torrent, a human flood that washed away 40 years of division in a single night of joyous, cathartic disbelief. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the final spectacular collapse of the fortress mentality. It was the ultimate proof that no wall is strong enough to contain the human desire for freedom. It was the ideological failure of brute force played out on the world stage for all to see. The same helplessness felt by the KGB colonel staring at a mannequin in a Moscow garage was now felt by the entire leadership of the Warsaw Pact. Their most powerful symbol of control had been defeated not by an army, but by an idea whose time had come. In the end, the story of the CIA in Moscow is the story of two conflicting philosophies. One side built a fortress, convinced that total control was the ultimate form of power. They built a system of watchers, of walls, of pervasive, suffocating surveillance, believing that if they could see everything, they could control everything. They ended up chasing puppets, lifeless imitations of men, blind to the reality that was unfolding just outside their narrow field of vision. The other side understood that true power lies not in control, but in freedom. They understood that the creativity of a few free-thinking individuals in a workshop could systematically dismantle a security apparatus of thousands. They weaponized ingenuity. They placed their faith in the audacity of the human mind to find a way through any wall, to create a gap in any defense. The Cold War, at its core, was a long, brutal contest between these two ideas. It was a war of economies, armies, and spies, but beneath it all, it was a war of the imagination. And it was won in those quiet moments of brilliance, the sudden deployment of a puppet, the calm exchange on a park bench, the simple, fearless act of walking through a gate that for decades had been sealed shut. The ultimate weapon was never the bomb. It was the mind's ability to see a world without walls, and the courage to simply walk through them as if they were never there at all.